Hello, I'm Jim Burnett, and I'm your host for the next several weeks. Our series is The Airplane and NASA. We'll trace how NASA, building on the previous work of NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, has played an important role in the field of aeronautics. In this, our first show, a prominent figure in the world of aviation, Paul Garber, shares some of his experiences with us. He takes us back to the very first days of powered flight, and he gives valuable insight into the growth of airplane technology. In later programs, we pick up the NASA aeronautical story in the 60s and move chronologically from then towards the present. Now, let's pick up the Garber interview as he talks about the films he's made on the history of flight.
I started off with natural flight because flight began with nature 250 million years ago with the first bug that flew, the Meganeura, 250 million years ago. And then after natural flight came imaginative flight, that's the next one. Man's yearnings to fly as shown in his imagination, where he couldn't make the thing, but he could think about it. And it's quite significant that he thought that angels could fly and that the gods could fly, because he thought the gods could do anything. Take Mercury, Hermes, the messenger of the gods who had wings, little things on his feet and on his helmet. Not much, very powerful wing loading, but it was an idea. Quite important that man had ideas. Everything starts with a good idea. So the imaginative flight, that's with religion, fantasy, fiction, poetry, art. And then the kite, the boomerang, then Da Vinci. Then the balloon, which was the first to lift man into the air. That was November 21, 1783, in Montgolfier in France, Paris. And then airships, which are powered balloons. And then the beginnings of heavier than aircraft, going back to Lannoy Bienvenue, 1784, were the first thing that ever raised itself by its own self-contained power, first step beyond the kite. A kite is far more than a toy. It can be a very interesting lesson in basic aerodynamics. It can show you things about center of thrust, center of gravity, and center of the pressure. And it can tell you things about dihedral for lateral stability and of keel surface for longitudinal stability. It's a very good teaching device. I saw it in the newspaper where Wright was flying at Fort Myer. This picture of the airplane and the statement about the flight. And I asked my father if I could have car fare to go to Fort Myer the next day. He gave me 50 cents or whatever it was. The next morning, or next afternoon it was, because it said the flying was late in the afternoon when the wind had died down. So I went over to Fort Myer. Remember, the trolley line was quite a distance away from the fort, but I ran all the way. And as I came to the fort and went through the gate, I could hear this sound. And as I passed the first short block and then came out where the huge field was, where they had the artillery and cavalry exercises, here, looking down, I saw the sound, the source of this noise, and it was this airplane. I'd never before seen an airplane. I'd seen pictures of them. But here was this enormous thing, this great big kite with two men in it. And the propellers turning over, and the engine sound, and coming toward us. And as I looked at it, I leaned back like that and fell down flat, but continued to look at it. And then got up and watched it as it flew around and around and around the field, going this way, I remember. And then finally came into a landing. Now, that memory has been enhanced by later knowledge so that I know now that it was on the 27th of July, 1909, because that was the day of the duration flight. Then the 30th was a day of the distance flight. That was the first round-trip flight in America when Wright flew from Fort Myer to Alexandria, around Shooter's Hill, and on back again, 10 miles in all. Yes, that remains to my mind as, well, I can look right through a 747 and see the Wright flyer. And then I was further astonished when I saw the airplane again in the Smithsonian, where it had been placed in 1911. So many times I would go there just to see that airplane once more. One day when I was again visiting the Smithsonian, I saw up on top of a case this rather large scale model of a Chanute glider. I learned later that Octave Chanute himself had given it to the Smithsonian following its use in a display in 1906. That was the first air show in America. So there it was. And I got permission to go up on a ladder where a man was cleaning the case and look at it more closely and see how it was made and get an idea about its dimensions. I went on home and made a copy of it. It's about yay span and about yay chord and had a extended boom arrangement with a quatrefoil tail on it. I made a copy of it. My mother helped me to tack the cloth on. She had what was called chintz in those days. Today they call it polished cotton. She had a whole bolt of red chintz. And we covered it with that. And then I went out in the backyard and assembled it. And then my model airplane club friends got together. We lifted it over the fence, on up the hill, to a place called the Red Lot. It was just red gravel, a lot of this red clay. And 3 big trees at the back end of it. We chose a windy day, and I got in this glider, or on it, or under it, had my arms over the longerons and my hands grasping the 2 struts here. And we had 2 lines going out from it with my friends on each line, and a good wind. And then I hollered to them to pull, and I began running with this thing. And sure enough, I began to rise. And they were so surprised to see me rise, they stopped running to look. And of course, we slid back on the glider's tail and my tail, and took a couple of weeks for repairs to both of us. But then we went again to the same location, and they kept running that time. And they ran to the end of the field, then down this rather steep at the far end of it, and then I glided above them and then over this lower section and across the trees and landed in the field on the far side. And today, when I'm in that area, I tell my friends, I flew over those trees. The trees are way up there now. Those days are down here. But I made about a dozen glides in this thing, and then one of the other fellows wanted to try it. He cracked it up. But that was the first time I was airborne, 1915. Airmail had begun at the Polo Grounds in Washington on May 15, 1918. That is, as a continuously scheduled public service between fixed stations. There'd been airmail before that, with the carrier pigeons and balloons and the pioneers of flight. But the first time that it became a public service, starting what we now have today, was this route between Washington and New York. And the Army began it on May 15th, then turned it over to the post office on August 12th. And I signed up when I got my discharge on December 14th, honorable discharge, that is. And then was signed in on the 17th, which just happened to be the 15th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight. And I was at College Park at the big field there. And I was by no means a route pilot. I have such admiration for those who were. I wouldn't dilute them by myself. But I learned to fly at that time because many of those pilots had been instructors. And they gave me some stick time once in a while. And I soloed on the 4th of July, the holiday of 1919. Soloed in a Curtis Jenny. And I helped with the mail. I was very proud to do my part. I do anything. They call me chief slave. And I do anything. I'd gas up the ships or check the tool bag and taxi out the airplane that is run alongside of it, or grab it as it came in, up to hold a wing. And mechanics worked on the engines, on the airframes. I was handy.
You know, Paul, you've been at the Smithsonian Institution since 1920.
Yes.
When you first joined the Smithsonian, what were some of your first duties?
I was called preparator. That means one who prepares things for display. And my job was to repair things that had broken. And there were many things. In fact, that's how I got the idea that I might work there. I'd been in the airmail service prior to that. But then, looking for another position, after I left the airmail reluctantly, because they were moving to Chicago, and I was to be based in Washington, My father was not well, asked me to stay in this area. But at the Smithsonian, there were many things that were broken. So wanting another job and loving that institution as I always have, I asked if a job might be available. And I met Luther Reed, who had been Langley's chief mechanic on his large aerodrome and on the small aerodromes also. You see, Langley was the secretary of the Smithsonian. That means the head. And the Langley Aerodrome, unmanned, of 1896, was the world's first ever heavier-than aircraft to be mechanically powered and to fly. Unmanned. Later on, the manned aircraft did not fly, but the unmanned one did. So Luther Reed was Langley's chief mechanic, and he was still living when I used to go there just to see the museum. I came to meet him. He loved clocks also. I tried to get there around 12 o'clock when all the clocks were striking, and I'd take him some ice cream. So he died in March. I got his job in June 1, 1920. And my duties were to repair things, a preparator. I'd repair anything. But then my interest was in aeronautics. And whenever I could finish one job and had nothing assigned to me, I'd work on something aeronautical. So this was a 3-month appointment. And it began to run out. And the boss was away on vacation. So finishing everything that I'd been told to do up to the time when my last day aboard had arrived, I then continued to work there, but making this model of Leonardo da Vinci's manual ornithopter, this wing flapper. Ornithopter, ornis from bird, and thopter from wing, bird wing job. And Leonardo da Vinci was my hero. I'd always admired the man. He had the greatest mind I think that's ever existed. And he was interested in flight. Well, Da Vinci marks the separation between the crazy ideas, like dew bottles they thought those were magic to rise, and harnessing birds, when human power was applied in a sensible manner to operating an aircraft. And I learned more about this from the librarian at the Smithsonian, and then made this model, just on my own, because I wanted to have something there of my own that I had made just to show my grandchildren when I came there in later years. But the secretary, who was then Dr. Walcott. In fact, Walcott was really the founder of what you are here. He was the founder of NACA, which is now NASA. Dr. Walcott saw this model, admired it, and gave me an extension, which has lasted for 61 and some months, years. And so I was a model maker, I was a model repairer. I'd do anything that had to be done to maintain the collection. But then, when I'd helped to get the Spirit of St. Louis, that brought so much attention to the aeronautical collections of the museum that it was decided to have a section of aeronautics, and I was put in charge of it.
So over your 61 years, Paul, no doubt you've met and talked with many famous aviators. I'm going to mention a few names, and maybe if you could just kind of highlight what you remember about each one. Charles Lindbergh?
I'd known of him as an airmail pilot because I'd been in the airmail myself. And I'd known of him with his service on the Chicago-St. Louis route because he was a very fine pilot. I knew of him through mutual friends. And then I came to know him after he had agreed to give the airplane to us. I met him in Memphis when he was on his circuit tour of the United States. I met him when he came to the museum to discuss it. Of course, I met him when he brought it to us on April 30, 1928. I met him when he visited the museum many times. Yes, I knew him quite well. He always called me by my first name. Mm-hmm. Once in a while, I forget and call him Slim.
What about Orville Wright?
He came to the museum in 1923. He wanted to see the Langley Aerodrome and consider it aerodynamically, and also to see whether it had been repaired as in its original condition. Of course, the Langley Aerodrome, the large one, was tested twice, October 7th and December 8th of 1903. Neither time did it fly. The first time, the front king post caught on the launching gear and pulled the wing down this way with a negative angle of incidence, just went into the water. The second time, the rear guy broke to the stabilizer. The aircraft went up like this on its back and again in the water. We don't know about the third time. It was never tested again until it was tested after it had been repaired and modified by Glenn Curtiss. And Orville Wright objected to the belief that the flight in 1914 proved that it might have flown in 1903. And he wanted to see the airplane again to remind himself about its details. I met him then. And I showed him a display I'd made because the 20th anniversary of the Kitty Hawk flight of 1903 was coming up again. I made this display. I made a scale model about yay big of the Kitty Hawk flyer. I had photographs of himself and his brother. I had an example of the Langley Medal. It was given to him and his brother in 1908. Early recognition of them, maybe the first in America. And then I had some other photographs of their gliders and wind tunnel. So I showed that to Orville Wright, and he was rather pleased to see it. And then he made a few comments of additional items that I needed, and I asked him for things that I knew I wanted. He was very gracious and gave me a number of photographs for it, made some suggestions about the model, and that started a pleasant relationship.
What about Glenn Curtiss?
Of course, I knew of him from the very early days, but in 1925, I was at the air races in New York City on Long Island, and he was there with the Curtiss Racers, which were beautiful aircraft, and the Curtiss R3C2 was being flown by Cy Bettis and with Jimmy Doolittle as alternate pilot, I remember. And then Al Williams was flying a similar airplane. Cy Bettis won that year. But as a contrast between the then current Curtiss Racers and the Curtiss aircraft of the early days, there was a Curtiss Pusher, which was flown by Bert Acosta. And then as it came back and was put up here on the line, Glenn Curtiss sat in it. And after his photograph was taken, I walked up, introduced myself, said I was from the museum. I said, would you consider giving this airplane to the Smithsonian? Well, he said, I hadn't thought of that. Well, I said, you're going to do something with it, and if you keep on flying it, you're busted up. How about giving it to us? He called to Frank Russell, who was standing by. He says, Frank, Paul Garber wants this airplane for his museum in Washington. And Frank Russell says, that's a good idea.
What about Wiley Post?
Yes, of course, everybody knew him, the wonderful flyer that he is, with only one eye. And a magnificent example of fortitude and determination in spite of a handicap. Wonderful example. I go sometimes to see my dear daughter, who's become an invalid. As I see these persons there in this hospital, I wish for something that would cause them to somehow try to overcome their handicap. But Wiley Post is a magnificent example of one who was handicapped by the loss of an eye. But he overcame that. One can, as I found out one time when I had an eye injury, one can regain somewhat perspective. That's what your two eyes give you, of course. To some extent, you get back a relationship of how far things are. But he was able to fly an airplane and to land it and fly it under the most difficult conditions. Yes, I knew him, but I knew him because of who he was. And I asked him for the Winnie Mae one time over to Hoover Field. Well, he says, I'm still using it. Well, I said, there'll come a time when you'll be turning it in on something else and like to have it for the museum. Meanwhile, I was offered other Lockheed Vegas, like Wilkins, or the one that was being flown by Stan Averill. But I kept on after the Winnie Mae of Wiley Post. We finally got it. And I would never have wished to have it the way we did. That was after his death. And then Mrs. Post was gracious to give it to us with a special arrangement by Josh Lee of Oklahoma, then in Congress.
Another character out of the past is Roscoe Turner with his Lion Gilmore.
Yes. I think I met him first when I was anxious to illustrate the beginnings of commercial aviation in the world. Aviation, that is, of course, aerostation was the first commercial. That's lighter than air. But aviation commercially began in Florida in January 1, 1914, with a Benoit flying boat flown by my good friend Tony Janis, who graduated from Tech High School as I did. Not when I did, I was some years after he. But he learned to fly at College Park, where I did, and then went with Benoit, that's B-E-N-O-I-S-T. Tom Benoit used to call his factory the Benoistery, because persons call him Benoist. But it was a Benoit flying boat flown by Tony Janis that was the world's first ever commercial. That was up for about 3 months between St. Petersburg and Tampa, which was across the route where there's now a bridge. In those days, those 8 miles were spanned by air. And I wanted to represent it in the museum. I helped to make a scale model of that flying boat. And then when I was given the model by the one who had sponsored it, then Roscoe Turner was in the group.
What about Amelia Earhart?
I saw her twice. I was at Muston Field at Philadelphia, that's the Navy field up there, when she came in, had a flat tire, and I helped a little bit to get it repaired. Sort of great privilege to roll that flat tire away and bring it back fixed up. A very gracious lady. And then I saw her one time at the White House when many famous pilots were being received by the president.
What about Howard Hughes?
When he made his marvelous flight in 1935, establishing a new transcontinental record, I wrote to him for his airplane. And he was reluctant to give it to us unless we had a place to put it on display. And at that time, we had no space for it. He said he would keep it until we did have a space for it. And one day, after the war, after World War II, he was walking toward me up Pennsylvania Avenue, and I recognized him. And I turned and got in step with him, introduced myself. I said, I'm the one that asked you for that airplane of yours. When do we get it? He said, you'll get it when you have a place to show it. Of course, we do have a place to show it now. It's beautiful. I think it's the most beautiful airplane we have. It's just as smooth as a baby's cheek, the lovely streamlining and craftsmanship on it. He says, in fact, I might fly it there because I still think it's faster than these jet jobs. Of course, he never did.
What about Lincoln Ellsworth?
He made Arctic and Antarctic flights. He was with Amundsen in the Norge. That was the Italian airship that went over the North Pole. And then he became interested in Antarctic flying and obtained a beautiful airplane, was one of the very first to be skin-stressed, the Northrop Gamma. I wanted that technically because of its characteristics and historically because of his flights in it. I asked him for that. He said, yes, but it'll still be my airplane because I still want to fly it. And he says, keep it in good shape for me. So I would. I'd pull the prop through every now and then. I'd check the battery. It was still flyable, it is today. I'm so impressed by what has been. When I think that when I was 9 years old, I saw Wright fly. When I was 69 years old, I saw a man step on the moon by television, making it all the more wonderful. And the marvelous things you've done here in NASA with this shuttle and the other tremendous exploits of going to the moon, that is the future. And you can tell that better than I. I can't predict the future. I'm too astounded at the past. That's my job. I'm supposed to be historian emeritus of the National Air and Space Museum.
I don't think there's anyone in the world that can say high flight like you can. Would you be willing to say it for us?
I wish McGee were here to say it. He's the one who wrote it. He was the victim of running into another airplane in World War II, crashed. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you had not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high on the sunlit heavens. Hovering there, I've chased the fleeting clouds along and flung my eagle craft through footless halls of air. Up, Up the high, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the snow-clad heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctities of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Paul Garber has the unique distinction of having lived through much of a century that saw great advancements in aeronautical technology. He has seen Orville Wright fly during the earliest days of the airplane, and he has seen Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. In the time separating those two legendary events, the United States has been steadily advancing the field of aeronautics. In 1958, we witnessed the birth of NASA. In the 1960s, NASA comes of age. However, before we concentrate on that period of time, we look at some of the developments and people responsible for the progress made in aircraft performance. This is the subject of next week's show, America's Wings. Till then, I'm Jim Burnett.